There is not a single animal in the world whose death is so colossal that it literally has its own name: whale fall. And one might think that the only thing that happens is that these creatures simply sink to the bottom of the abyss, never to be seen again. But what actually happens is the equivalent of a meteorite impact for all marine life. A meteorite of several tons of flesh and bone. At the end of its life, a whale that can weigh dozens of tons enters a phase in which every breath becomes a challenge. The musculature that for years propelled the body toward the surface begins to fail. Fat reserves are no longer mobilized with the same efficiency, and the long feeding journeys exhaust an organism that needs to surface periodically to breathe. Old age in these colossi is not just a matter of accumulated years, but of simple physics. Lifting such an enormous mass up through the water column requires an immense expenditure of energy, and there comes a point when many individuals can no longer do so with the necessary frequency. To these natural causes are added others that are more abrupt. Infectious diseases, parasites that weaken the animal, poisoning from pollutants, collisions with large ships that cause internal hemorrhages or fractures of ribs and vertebrae, and even attacks by groups of orcas that repeatedly bite a weakened prey. In all cases, the physiological outcome is the same. The lungs stop filling with air regularly, and oxygen exchange is interrupted. The organism is submerged in water, yet it dies of asphyxiation. When the heart stops, the animal may continue floating for a few minutes, propelled by the air that remains trapped in the lungs and airways. However, inside, the process of decomposition begins almost immediately. Bacteria that already lived in the intestine and other tissues begin to break down proteins and lipids in an environment without circulation, generating gases such as carbon dioxide, methane, and hydrogen sulfide. These gases accumulate in cavities and between muscle fibers, gradually transforming the body into a swollen mass, lighter than the surrounding water. Here, physics reverses. In life, most large species were only slightly denser than seawater and needed to fill their lungs to gain buoyancy. After death, the lung air is lost, but the gases from decomposition compensate for that loss, and if they accumulate sufficiently, turn the carcass into a biological balloon. Suddenly, a body that tended to sink becomes strongly buoyant. This change is not always obvious to a human observer, but it is critical to the fate of the carcass. It determines whether it will drift at the surface for days or sink quickly toward the bottom. When gases accumulate intensely, the visible result is a deformed animal with skin stretched tight as a drum and a swollen belly. In that phase, the body can float for weeks, carried by surface currents and wind. The image is that of an island of flesh drifting at sea, surrounded by seabirds that land to tear strips of fat with their beaks, and by fish approaching from below to bite at the hanging tissue. Gulls, albatrosses, and petrels compete for the fattiest pieces. Beneath the surface, sharks, large fish, and other scavengers take advantage of every fragment that breaks away. This initial feast has clear physical consequences for the carcass. The bites of birds and fish tear the skin and open pathways through which gases escape, while the loss of fat reduces the buoyancy generated by the tissues. In parallel, internal decomposition continues. Connective tissue weakens, organs lose cohesion, and part of the abdominal contents may spill outward. The result is a body that is increasingly perforated, less sealed, and therefore less capable of retaining the gases that kept it afloat at the surface. In some cases, the carcass never reaches this prolonged drifting phase. If death occurs at a certain depth, if the animal was very thin, or if decomposition is slow due to low temperatures, the gases produced are not enough to compensate for the total weight, and the body descends almost from the beginning. But when death occurs near the surface, the most common sequence is a period of floating followed by a gradual collapse. The carcass goes from being a swollen balloon to a lax structure that can no longer support itself. The moment when the balance breaks is abrupt. Sometimes a large shark bite, a strong wave, or the opening of a cavity is enough for the trapped gas to escape in seconds. The overall density of the whole mass shoots up. The proportion of bones, muscles, and solid organs far exceeds that of the remaining gases. The body stops behaving like a float, and once again becomes what it always was according to the physics of seawater, a mass of tons, too heavy to remain suspended at the surface. The body begins to gain speed the moment it loses buoyancy. At first the descent is slow, slowed by the resistance of the water against the enormous surface of the carcass. But as it sinks and the volume of residual gas compresses under increasing pressure, the hole becomes even denser and the fall accelerates. It is not a free fall as in air, but it is a constant and irreversible movement, a vertical trajectory that can last for hours if the seafloor lies thousands of meters deep. On its journey downward, the carcass passes through several layers of the ocean. It leaves behind the sunlit zone, where phytoplankton and fish that depend on photosynthesis still exist, and enters a region of twilight in which colors fade and blue becomes almost uniform. Deeper still, from a few hundred meters onward, the descent continues through darkness broken only by flashes of bioluminescence, small organisms that emit light in response to disturbances in the water. The passage of such a large mass generates eddies and local currents that can trigger that flickering of luminous points, as if the carcass were dragging a rain of living sparks behind it. In terms of time, the journey can vary greatly. If the seafloor is at 1,000 meters, the body may take around 1 or 2 hours to arrive. If the depth approaches 4,000 meters, the trip lasts longer, but it is still brief compared to the years the animal needed to grow. Meanwhile, the carcass continues to be a source of food even while falling. Some mid-water fish, squids, and other opportunistic scavengers can detect the trail of tissues and seize the opportunity to tear off pieces as it passes. Each bite releases a cloud of fatty fragments that drift a few meters before sinking, feeding organisms that would never have had access to such a large prey. As it approaches the bottom, the environment changes once again. Pressure exceeds 300 or 400 atmospheres, the water temperature remains just above freezing, and sunlight no longer reaches at all. The typical landscape is a plain of fine sediments, accumulated over millions of years from particles that slowly fall from the surface. Microscopic remains of organisms, mineral dust, feces compacted into that marine snow, which is the basic supply of food for almost all life on the seafloor. In this context of permanent scarcity, the descent of a whale carcass represents an exceptional event. On an energetic scale, it is equivalent to suddenly concentrating decades of marine snow in a single point. From the perspective of bottom-dwelling organisms, it is the arrival of a mountain of carbon and nutrients in a place where the norm is to live with barely enough. But that mountain does not appear out of nowhere. It arrives with speed and drags with it a column of water that compresses against the sediment at the moment of impact. The collision with the seafloor can be violent. The body does not visibly bounce, but it deforms the sediment, sinking partially into it and stirring up a cloud of fine particles that remain suspended around it. If the animal fell on its side, its weight crushes the lower part into the mud and leaves the upper part exposed. If it falls on its belly or back, some areas of the body remain buried while others arch upward, creating shadows and shelters immediately usable by small organisms. In any case, the result is a physical alteration of the landscape that will remain visible for years. The impact also has a chemical effect. Fluids still present in the abdominal cavity, coagulated blood, and remnants of viscera mix with the sediment and release a strong signal of dissolved organic compounds. This signal spreads with the bottom current and becomes a chemical trail that many animals can detect from a distance. In an environment where any trace of food matters, the presence of amino acids, fatty acids, and other compounds from the carcass triggers an almost immediate response in the local scavengers. The first to arrive are usually mobile animals, capable of covering relatively large distances. Hagfish and other eel-like fishes, which spend most of their time buried in the mud, can emerge and move toward the source of the odor. Deep-sea sharks, slow-moving but steady, change course guided by extremely sensitive chemical receptors. crabs, amphipods, and other crustaceans abandon their scattered foraging routines and converge on the same area. On a human scale, it would be like a crowd running toward a warehouse when a rumor spreads that food is being given away. Within a few hours, the carcass is surrounded. Many of these animals have never encountered such a large prey in their entire lives. The size of the body allows dozens of individuals to feed simultaneously, without disturbing each other too much, at least at first. Some pierce the still resistant skin with specialized teeth. Others enter through natural openings, such as the mouth, anus, or previous wounds from the floating phase. Through these entrances, they advance inward, where the flesh is softer and protected from direct contact with water. The sediment cloud generated by the impact has not yet fully settled when the first bites begin to tear off tissue fragments. Each pull releases another cloud, this time of organic particles, muscle fibers, fat cells, pieces of skin. As hours and then days pass, the surface of the body becomes completely covered with moving animals. Hagfish, appearing like slimy eels, pierce the skin and make their way inward, where the flesh remains softer. To advance, they can tie knots with their own bodies and use this twisting as a lever to pull off bites. Deep-sea sharks, with slower but powerful jaws, focus on fat-rich areas such as the subcutaneous adipose layer or the belly region. Bony fishes of various sizes take advantage of openings made by others to slip in and feed on remains that would be out of reach in an intact carcass. The larger animals occupy the most exposed areas: flanks, back, head. The smaller ones concentrate on edges, gaps, or slide between intercostal spaces to reach places beyond the reach of shark teeth. At the same time, in the sediment surrounding the carcass, small crustaceans and numerous invertebrates feed on fragments dislodged by each bite. Nothing is wasted. What some tear off and cannot hold, others capture as it falls. The result is progressive erosion. Within a few weeks, if the carcass is very large and the scavenger community abundant, the most superficial layers of skin and fat may disappear almost entirely. Striated muscles, fin bones, parts of the rib cage, and the skull structure are exposed. The carcass transforms from a compact mass into a set of interconnected elements, traversed by tunnels and cavities created by the most persistent consumers. The activity not only alters the shape of the body, but also modifies the immediate surroundings. Each time a group of animals moves, it stirs up the sediment and suspends it in the water. Each time a shark bites, it releases muscle fibers and drops of fat that fall around like a dense rain. A few meters from the carcass, the seafloor becomes a mixture of dark mud, decomposing tissues, and the waste of the scavengers themselves. This ring of enriched sediment becomes a resource in itself for organisms that do not need to attack the carcass directly, but benefit from the excess organic matter it generates. Over time, the composition of the community changes. The large visitors, once the easiest to consume portions are exhausted, appear less frequently. There are still areas of meat attached to bones or protected by folds of skin, but each new bite requires more effort. In contrast, small crustaceans, polychaete worms, and other invertebrates become more numerous. Many of them dig burrows in the sediment immediately adjacent to the skeleton, where organic material accumulates and slowly degrades. It is in this phase that the carcass stops being just a direct source of tissue and begins to function as a focus of environmental enrichment. The organic matter infiltrated into the top layer of sediment serves as food for microorganisms and small detritivores. These, in turn, become prey for mid-sized predators. On paper, it looks like a simple food chain, but in practice it means that a region of the seafloor that was previously relatively homogeneous transforms into a mosaic of microhabitats, more anoxic zones within the mud, places where semi-buried fat accumulates, patches with higher bacterial density. The duration of this opportunistic phase is not fixed. It depends on the size of the animal, the water temperature, the initial amount of fat, and the number of organisms exploiting the resource. It can extend for several years, during which the sediment around the bones maintains a concentration of organic matter much higher than the distant seafloor. From the perspective of a small worm or burrowing crustacean, settling in this area means having a stable food source in an environment where, far from the carcass, it would be necessary to travel far to find the same. Meanwhile, the main structure continues to thin. Muscles first reduced to strips, then to loose fibers, and finally to a barely visible film. The vertebrae, ribs, and skull bones become increasingly exposed, although still covered by remnants of connective tissue and internal fat deposits not visible from the outside. These internal lipids are much harder for large animals to reach, but their presence sets the stage for another type of colonizer. In the immediate surroundings, hundreds of small burrows could be counted within a few meters around the skeleton. Each corresponds to an organism that benefits directly or indirectly from the carcass's residues. Some feed on detritus, others are predators waiting for a clumsier neighbor to leave its tunnel. The combined effect is that the fall of a single whale significantly increases the density and diversity of benthic life in that patch of seafloor. This more radical phase begins when the visible feast is almost over, but the skeleton is still full of energy. Although the carcass appears clean at first glance, the interior of the bones still contains a high percentage of lipids, fats and oils that can represent several percent of the animal's total weight, and that degrade much more slowly than muscle or skin. Around these bones, the seafloor environment changes. The sediment immediately adjacent has been enriched with organic matter during the previous phase, and respiration by bacteria and small detritivores has consumed much of the oxygen available in the mud's pores. Under these more anoxic conditions, microorganisms capable of respiring not oxygen but sulfate dissolved in seawater thrive. By breaking down lipids and other organic compounds, these bacteria release hydrogen sulfide, a gas toxic to most animals, but an extraordinary chemical energy source for certain groups of specialized microbes. The situation is similar, in a localized version, to what happens at hydrothermal vents or cold methane seeps. Instead of relying on sunlight, primary production is based on chemical reactions. Chemosynthetic bacteria that use hydrogen sulfide or methane as an energy source form whitish or yellowish mats on the surface of the bones and surrounding sediment. These mats convert inorganic compounds into biomass and become the first link in a completely new food chain on the skeleton. In the midst of this landscape appears one of the most striking protagonists of this phase, worms of the genus Osedax, commonly known as bone-eating worms or zombie worms. They were first described in the early 2000s when cameras on underwater vehicles revealed on the bones of a decomposing whale structures resembling small plants, with a crown of red feathers at the top and a kind of stalk that penetrated directly into the bone. The morphology of these worms defies what one would expect from a classic annelid. The females, which are the visible forms, have neither a mouth nor a functional digestive tract. Instead, they have a crown of respiratory feathers and a trunk that ends in a tangle of greenish roots that penetrate the interior of the bone. Through these roots, the animal does not bite the bone like a fish or crustacean, but dissolves it chemically. It has been shown that the tissues of the roots contain mucus with acidic compounds capable of decalcifying the bone matrix, releasing the trapped lipids. The worm does not consume these lipids directly. Inside the roots lives a community of symbiotic bacteria that exploit the released compounds and transform them into substances the worm can assimilate. The result is an intimate association. The worm provides the bacteria with constant access to the resource, and the bacteria, in return, feed it from within. In this way, Osedax becomes a biological machine for converting bone fat into animal and microbial biomass, without needing classical digestive organs or moving far from the bone. The reproductive cycle adds another peculiarity. In many species, the males are tiny, almost microscopic, and live inside the tubes or even within the body cavities of the female, forming true miniature harems. From there, they continuously release sperm, ensuring that any egg produced by the female is fertilized. When a new carcass reaches the sea floor, the larvae that find the bone in the first moments tend to develop as females. Later, when the site is already occupied, many larvae that settle do so as males. This allows for rapid initial colonization, while also ensuring that each established female has numerous males available in a confined space. Over time, the activity of these worms completely transforms the bone structure. The roots perforate the surface and make it porous, creating internal galleries that increase the complexity of the microhabitat. This additional porosity facilitates the diffusion of hydrogen sulfide and other compounds into the surrounding sediment, expanding the area where chemosynthetic bacteria can thrive. At the same time, the tunnels provide refuges for other tiny invertebrates that use the cracks as hiding places and feeding points. In this way, Osedax acts as a true ecosystem engineer, physically modifying the resource and creating space for a greater diversity of associated species. The bones, enriched with lipids and traversed by galleries, support chemosynthetic communities for years or even decades. The exact duration depends on the amount of available fat, depth, temperature, and the degree of colonization. In well-oxygenated environments, estimates suggest that sulfur-based communities can remain active for about a decade. In colder or less ventilated conditions, this period may be longer, although it is also affected by the intensity with which the worms and other organisms destroy the bone. Throughout this time, the skeleton remains a point of high productivity in an otherwise generally poor environment. Bivalves with symbiotic bacteria in their gills settle on the bones or in the surrounding sulfur-rich sediment, exploiting the same energy source as the bacterial mats. Snails, small crustaceans, and other invertebrates feed on these bivalves, the bacteria, or the detritus that accumulates among the remains. The community turns out to be a mix of species typical of hydrothermal vents, methane seeps, and normal abyssal seafloors, gathered at a single point because both the physical structure of the skeleton and the chemical gradients enabling chemosynthesis are concentrated there simultaneously. When the sulfophilic phase is exhausted and the internal lipids have nearly disappeared, the skeleton no longer functions as an important source of chemical energy. What remains is a hollow mineral structure, lightened by years of perforations and tunnels, but still solid compared to the soft sediment that surrounds it. In the abyssal seafloor landscape, dominated by fine and uniform mud, any hard surface becomes a valuable resource. The vertebrae, ribs, and skull bones then take on a new role: physical support for organisms that need something stable to attach to in order to live. The first colonizers of this stage are usually sessile invertebrates that feed by filtering particles from the water column. Sponges of various shapes attach to the most exposed areas of the vertebrae, where bottom currents are slightly stronger and allow a constant flow of water rich in small organic particles. On the upper surfaces of the ribs and the protrusions of the skull, bryozoans, some branched hydrozoans, and anemones settle, extending their tentacles to capture any particle or small animal carried by the current. Over time, these structures cover the contours of the skeleton, adding volume and complexity to the original relief of the bones. On soft sediment, the presence of a patch of rigid structure has another effect. It creates shelters between the exposed trabeculae, in the spaces left by worm roots, and in partially collapsed cavities. Small mobile invertebrates accumulate, using these hollows as hiding places from larger predators. Shrimp, amphipods, small crabs, and snails find protected corners there where they can feed on detritus, colonies of microorganisms, or larvae that settle on the newer surfaces. On a centimeter scale, the skeleton becomes a network of passages and inhabited chambers. The structure also attracts bottom-dwelling fish. Some small species use the tangle of bones and sessile organisms as resting and hunting areas, moving among the ribs to capture invertebrates that venture onto the outer surfaces. Other larger species patrol the perimeter, taking advantage of the higher density of potential prey. The contrast with the surrounding seafloor is striking. A few meters away from the skeleton, the sediment becomes relatively homogeneous again, with scattered life and little relief. On and around the bones, however, the density of organisms and microhabitats remains above average, even though there is no longer an extraordinary input of carbon. Over the years, the bone structure itself continues to degrade. The mechanical action of currents, chemical dissolution, and the activity of boring organisms gradually thin the walls of the bones. Some vertebrae eventually break and collapse onto the sediment. Partially buried ribs become covered and disappear from view. Sponge spicules, fragments of calcareous bryozoan skeletons, and deep-water coral remains mix with the mineral particles of the mud, slightly altering the composition of the sediment below and around the former skeleton. On a human scale, one could say that the visible trace disappears. On a geological scale, the local concentration of carbonate and organic matter remains recorded in the sediment column. The total time during which a whale's remains continue to influence the ecosystem can approach a century. The phases partially overlap. As long as there is still some flesh, the sediments become enriched. As long as part of the lipid reserve remains, chemosynthetic communities establish themselves. When these are exhausted, the transformed skeleton continues to function as a small reef. This prolongation means that at any given moment, the seafloor can host numerous falls at different stages, even if the influence area of each is limited. Globally, estimates suggest that before industrial whaling, a much larger number of whales died each year than today, simply as a natural consequence of more abundant populations. Each death could potentially generate such an event if the carcass sank in the open sea. Massive whaling in the 19th and 20th centuries disrupted this balance in several ways. On one hand, the removal of large amounts of biomass before animals died of natural causes drastically reduced the number of carcasses on the sea floor. On the other hand, during much of the industrial period, many carcasses from whaling were processed on land or near the coast and did not reach the deep-sea contributions comparable to those in the open ocean. This reduction in events has implications for specialized communities that depend on them. If large whale falls are less frequent and more spatially separated, species closely linked to these oases may have fewer opportunities to colonize new sites before the previous ones are depleted. Some hypotheses suggest that in an ocean with more whales, falls could function as stepping stones, allowing organisms typical of methane seeps or hydrothermal vents to move between distant points, using the skeletons as intermediate stations. A reduction in the density of these stepping stones would mean longer journeys through nutrient-poor areas, less favorable for species with limited dispersal larvae. Today, carcasses that reach the seafloor can come from both natural deaths and human-related causes: collisions with ships, entanglement in fishing gear, or stress from noise and environmental changes. Some of these animals wash up on beaches and follow a completely different fate, associated with decomposition processes in the intertidal zone or on land. Others, however, float for a time and are then carried offshore, where they finally sink and go through a series of ecological stages similar to those described. In these cases, the energy input to the seafloor exists, even if the context that caused it resulted from a negative interaction with human activities.